The wasteland stretched out in all directions, a barren graveyard of ash and ruin. My boots crunched against brittle dirt as I walked, rifle slung over my shoulder and pack bouncing lightly on my back. The gray sky loomed heavy above me, indifferent to the struggles below. Hours had passed since I last stopped, and my throat was dry enough to crack. Supplies were running low. Water, food, ammo, everything. It was then I spotted it. A cabin, tucked against the jagged base of a hill. The structure was worn but fortified. Stakes surrounded it like a macabre fence, and strings of rusted tin cans dangled from the roofline, jangling faintly in the breeze. A warning. Or a trap. "Keep walking," I muttered under my breath. But my legs had other plans. I angled toward the cabin, keeping my rifle ready. A voice barked out before I even reached the perimeter. "Don't bother sneaking. I already got you in my sights." I froze, spotting the figure seated on the porch, a wiry old man in a tattered coat, a wide-brimmed hat shading his weathered face. He had a shotgun balanced across his knees, one hand resting on it as casually as if it were an old friend. "I'm not here for trouble," I called, raising my hands slightly. "Trouble don't knock," he replied. "What are you here for?" "Food, water, ammo, if you've got it." The man squinted at me, his eyes sharp despite the lines carved into his face. "You'll take what I give, but it ain't for free. You listen to me, boy, and you listen good. You get it?" I nodded cautiously. "Got it." He motioned me closer, gesturing to a rickety chair on the porch. I climbed the steps slowly, my eyes flicking between him and the shotgun that never left his grip. The porch smelled of old wood and sweat, the boards creaking beneath me as I sat. Up close, the man looked even older, his beard a tangle of gray and his skin toughened like leather. But there was something in his eyes. Calculated. Watchful. "Name's Elias," he said. "Sonny." He handed me a tin cup of water, and I downed it in one go. The water was stale, but it was the best thing I'd tasted in days. "You're lucky you came this way," Elias said. "Could have ended up worse. Way worse." "Worse how?" I asked, setting the cup down. He leaned back in his chair, his voice dropping. "The dead follow patterns. The longer you're out here, the more you see it. They ain't mindless. Not all of them, anyway. Some of the older ones. They learn. They remember." I frowned. "What are you talking about?" "There's a canyon south of here," he continued. "Looks like a good shortcut. But if you go down there, you won't come out. The dead there are different. They watch. They wait. They know the routes people take. And they use the canyon to trap 'em. You go in. You're done." His words made my skin crawl. "Why haven't they spread out then?" Elias snorted. "Who knows? Maybe they're territorial. Maybe they just like having a hunting ground. All I know is, people who don't listen to me end up joining them." I swallowed hard, trying to shake off the unease creeping into my gut. "You've seen this happen?" "More times than I'd like," Elias said grimly. "Thought I could warn folks, but not everyone listens. Young and stupid think they know better. They don't." I stayed silent, staring at the horizon beyond the cabin. "Take what you need from my stash," Elias said, waving a hand toward the door. "But if you go south, you'll be signing your death warrant." I nodded, rising from the chair. Inside, the cabin was cramped but orderly, with shelves lined with canned goods, jars of water, and old maps. I grabbed a few supplies, mindful not to take more than I needed. "Thanks for the warning," I said as I stepped back onto the porch. Elias fixed me with a hard stare. "Don't thank me unless you listen to it." The weight of his words stayed with me as I walked away from the cabin. The idea of dead things that weren't just predators, but hunters, aware, calculating, made my blood run cold. And as I glanced toward the distant cliffs of the canyon, the path ahead felt darker than ever. The canyon yawned before me, a jagged scar in the earth. The cliffs loomed on either side, their rocky faces streaked with shadows that seemed to writhe as the light shifted. Elias's words echoed in my mind, but hunger and exhaustion dulled their warning. If the canyon was a trap, it didn't look like one. Just another stretch of wasteland. The descent was treacherous. Loose stones skittered underfoot, sending echoes bouncing off the cliffs. The air was heavy, still, and smelled faintly of rot. I tightened my grip on my rifle, the weight of it both reassuring and ominous. At first, nothing happened. The canyon floor was barren, strewn with rocks and dried-out bones that might have once belonged to animals, or something else. The silence was oppressive, the kind that pressed against your chest and made you second-guess every sound you thought you'd heard. Then I noticed the tracks. They weren't human, not exactly. The footprints were twisted, uneven, as though whatever made them had walked on broken bones. They led deeper into the canyon, overlapping in chaotic patterns, like a dance of madness etched into the dirt. Something was watching me. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. The kind of prickle at the back of your neck that comes when you're not alone. I scanned the cliffs, the shadows, the crevices, but the canyon offered no answers, only dread. The first attack came suddenly. A low growl rumbled through the air, followed by the sound of skittering, like claws on stone. I spun around just as a figure lunged from the shadows. It was one of the dead, but not like the shambling corpses I'd faced before. This one was lean, fast, its rotting flesh stretched tight over sinewy muscles. Its jaw unhinged as it let out a guttural snarl, revealing rows of broken, jagged teeth. I fired, the shot echoing like thunder. The creature's head snapped back, black ichor spraying from the wound as it collapsed in a heap. But the sound woke the canyon. The shadows began to move, crawling across the rocks like living things. More figures emerged, their twisted forms lurching toward me with terrifying speed. Their eyes glinted with a predatory intelligence, and their mouths stretched into grotesque grins. I ran. The canyon walls closed in around me, the path narrowing as I stumbled over rocks and bones. The creatures pursued me relentlessly, their snarls and growls blending into a cacophony of terror. I fired blindly over my shoulder, each shot illuminating their monstrous shapes in brief, strobe-like flashes. One of them lunged at me from the side, its claws raking across my arm. Pain exploded through me, warm blood soaking into my sleeve. I swung my rifle like a club, the butt connecting with a sickening crunch as the creature fell away. But there were too many. Another one grabbed at my leg, its claws sinking into my boot. I kicked wildly, the sound of its bones snapping under my heel drowned out by its shriek. The ground beneath me was slick with blood. Mine. Theirs. It didn't matter. Ahead, the canyon narrowed further, forming a natural choke point. I stumbled toward it, my breath ragged, my vision swimming. If I could just bottleneck them, maybe I'd have a chance. Reaching the choke point, I turned and fired, the rifle kicking against my shoulder as the first creature charged. The bullet tore through its chest, black blood spraying across the rocks. Another followed, and another. Each shot slowing them, but never stopping the tide. They were faster than I could reload. One of them climbed the canyon wall, its claws digging into the rock like it was soft clay. It launched itself at me, teeth snapping. I ducked, but not fast enough. Its claws raked my back, tearing through fabric and flesh. I screamed, the sound raw and animalistic, and swung my rifle in a wide arc. The creature's skull caved in with a wet crunch, but the effort left me off balance. More were coming. They poured out of the shadows like a living flood, their bodies contorting unnaturally as they closed the distance. I backed into the narrowest part of the canyon, my rifle trembling in my hands. "This is it," I muttered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. Suddenly, a deafening blast tore through the air. The lead creature exploded in a spray of gore, its remains splattering across the canyon walls. Another shot followed, then another, each one precise and deadly. I turned, bloodied and gasping, to see Elias standing at the edge of the canyon, a scoped rifle in his hands. His expression was grim, his movements steady as he picked off the creatures one by one. "Move, boy," he shouted. Adrenaline surged through me as I stumbled toward him, the creature snarling in fury behind me. Elias's shots continued to ring out, each one buying me another second of life. I reached him just as the last of the creatures fell. Their bodies littered the canyon floor, a grotesque tapestry of death and decay. Elias lowered his rifle, his face hard as he looked me over. "You didn't listen," he said coldly. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. The weight of my mistake hung heavy in the air, thicker than the stench of blood. "You're lucky I was watching," Elias continued. "Next time, there won't be one." I nodded weakly, the pain in my arm and back a grim reminder of how close I'd come to death. Elias turned and walked away, leaving me to follow in silence. The canyon had taught me a brutal lesson, one I wouldn't forget. We made it back to Elias's cabin just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows across the wasteland. Every step was agony. My back and arm throbbed with searing pain, and my head swam from blood loss. I stumbled onto the porch, collapsing into one of the creaking chairs, as Elias silently closed the door behind us. "Sit tight," he muttered, moving with practiced efficiency to gather supplies from a battered wooden chest in the corner. The cabin smelled of old wood and herbs, the faint scent of smoke lingering in the air. The walls seemed to close in on me as the adrenaline faded, leaving only the dull, gnawing ache of my wounds and the memory of those twisted, intelligent monsters. Elias returned with a tin of alcohol, strips of cloth, and a needle threaded with coarse black string. "This is gonna hurt," he said, no sympathy in his tone. "I deserve it," I muttered. "You're damn right you do," he snapped, pouring alcohol onto a rag and pressing it hard against the jagged cuts on my arm. I hissed through gritted teeth, my body tensing as the pain flared. "You're lucky I was watching," Elias said as he worked, his voice low but cutting. "That canyon's taken better men than you. I don't warn people for my health, boy. I warn them because I've seen what happens when they don't listen." I stayed silent, my jaw clenched as he began stitching the wound on my arm. "You think you're the first to ignore me?" Elias continued. "Think you're the first to think you know better? You're not. The ones who didn't listen, hell, I can still see their faces. Sometimes I think I hear 'em out there, part of the damn things now." I shivered, not just from the cold, but from the weight of his words. "When did you learn about them?" I asked finally, my voice hoarse. Elias paused, his hands steady, but his gaze distant. "Lost someone important," he said simply. "Thought I could handle it. Thought I'd be the exception. Turns out the Wasteland doesn't make exceptions." The stitching done, Elias stood and grabbed a worn cloth to wipe his hands. "You were lucky today, Sonny, but luck doesn't last. Wisdom does." I nodded slowly, the gravity of his words settling over me. "I'll remember that." "You'd better," he said, his tone sharp. "Because out there, you don't get second chances. You've seen what happens when you ignore the ones who know better." I sat there for a long time, staring at the walls of the cabin and the strange symbols etched into the wood. They weren't just scratches. They were warnings, marks of survival etched by a man who had fought and endured more than anyone should. Finally, I stood and grabbed a pencil from my pack. My hands shook as I looked at the paper in my hands, but I steadied myself and began to write. In bold, jagged letters, I scrawled, "Rule 19. Respect the elders." They've seen the horrors you can't imagine. Their wisdom keeps you alive. Elias said nothing as he watched me write, but when I turned, I thought I saw a flicker of approval in his tired eyes. The wasteland was still waiting, vast and unrelenting. But as I stepped off that porch, I carried something more than supplies. I carried the weight of my mistakes and the lessons they'd carved into me. And this time, I'd listen.